In this session, we'll be talking about the book of Isaiah. We won't be able to talk about all of the prophets in subsequent sessions, but just wanted to take one to kind of give something of an illustration or of a way in which, as we read the prophets, it might be helpful to be able to engage the text. So we'll take Isaiah, the first of the major prophets, and as such it's kind of a centerpiece of Israel's story. And also being the first of the major prophets, the book of Isaiah also helps guide us through. It presents the major themes that prophets are going to be talking about, and it gives us a guide as to how we can approach the other prophets. Isaiah is a big book. And in our Protestant Bibles, it has 66 chapters, and as we've noted about the prophets, their first word is actually to the historical circumstance to which they are speaking. So in this case, Isaiah is speaking to the southern part of the kingdom, which is Judah. And he is speaking in the historical context of the Assyrian threat. Up to the north, the powerful Assyrians have descended, and they wipe out Israel, but they are not able to wipe out the southern kingdom of Judah. But in order to know why it is that God is speaking to Judah and what it is that has created this circumstance, let's just put together a couple of simple things. One is that throughout this prophet, as well as the other prophets, you're going to see the judgment of God and hope. I mean, these two themes will just always be together. So you'll get a sense of the reality that God has engaged, and He is judging His people. He's going to purify His people. He's going to remake His people. And out of that, He's going to renew His people. Why is He doing all of this? There are some failures that Israel has experienced. One is that they have just simply had a lack of trust in God. And it is very tempting to trust other nations, to trust other kings and kingdoms, and as they look around the map to seek to create alliances. And basically all of that means one thing: they do not trust God. A second thing that is part of the entire story of why God is judging is that Israel, or Judah, and Israel as well, had always flirted with idols. There had always been the fascination, along with seeing world powers around them, with the gods of those other nations. And Israel herself was always being tempted to embrace the gods of other nations. And a final and third theme that you'll just see this all throughout the prophets. A reason why they are under the judgment of God is the lack of social justice. And oftentimes this appears as a lack of social justice with reference to poor or marginalized. And so these three things kind of become the striking points of God's judgment. However, His judgment is always coupled with that of hope. That is, just because God is judging His people, and it will be a severe judgment, there's no doubt about it. It will be the kind of judgment in which destruction does come, but there's always the hope. In this case, the hope, the reality that God's mission is not thwarted in His judgment, that there will be a remnant, that God will continue with what He has done, and that His judgment, in fact, is a way that God relates to his people. It is the way that he reacts to his people, so that through these fires of judgment, he can create from that, or he can create out of that, the people who will continue and further his mission to all of the nations. So, in this big book of Isaiah, we'll do it this way. Chapters 1 through 39 seem to be, well, they are. They're set in a particular historical era, in which, in the beginning of those chapters, we see the engagement with Assyria. And then there just seems to be a chronological break at the end of chapter 39. And when we get into chapter 40 through the rest of the book, through chapter 66, it is clear as if the story has been transported 150 or so years or 200 years in advance, or beyond that of the historical context of Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. So all of this appears in one book, but it is clear that the exile, that is the destruction ultimately of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and the people of Jerusalem are in exile, it is clear that event has in fact happened at the end, or when you begin chapter 40. And so this can become somewhat disconcerting to some people, wondering how could you have historical events that are so chronologically distant appear all in one book as if they were written by one author. And no matter what position you take, whether it was an instance where Isaiah predicted in the more common sense, he predicted, foresaw the future, or disciples of Isaiah wrote years later, all of it, regardless of either way, all of it came together, all of it inspired by God. All of it came together as scripture and as what we have in Isaiah. So although there are a lot of scholarly discussions and arguments concerning these particular matters of authorship and time, I'm just going to encourage you just to take the text of Isaiah itself and do exactly what we're doing. Understand the reality of the big theme of judgment coupled with hope. Why is it that God is judging Israel? What is it that God will do in hope and bring out of all of that judgment? So, back to the opening, or the first part of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39. It's in the context of the Syrian threat. And in opening visions, we actually get something of a contrast between an old Jerusalem and a new Jerusalem, an old city and a new city. And as you could imagine, this is going to become a very significant contrast as we go through, or as you read through the book of Isaiah, and you'll see this in other prophets. You'll see this theme or this particular kind of contrast picked up by Jesus. But this is going to become a very significant thing, because Jerusalem is the place where God makes his residence. It's where he dwells. It is where he lives among the people. And God's judgment is going to be such that, especially with the Babylonian captivity, that the place of his residence is to Israel, to those who are in exile. It is as if they have, in a sense, lost their God. But before the exile, Isaiah is going to talk about a couple of the kings of Judah, and he does so in a way that's not intended just to give us historical or chronological insight or reporting of those kings. He does it to set up a bigger story. So, for example, he will talk about King Ahaz, who was from the line of David, and King Hezekiah. King Ahaz did not trust God at all, and he is a king that did seek to make an alliance with the nation and rely upon the power of that alliance rather than relying upon God. And so King Ahaz becomes something of a model in Isaiah of a king simply not relying and trusting on God. On the other side of this is Hezekiah, who is a king who has a wonderful moment in which he does trust in God, and then it turns right around and invites the Babylonians for a visit and a look-see at all of the things that Jerusalem has, shows them the treasures, where they are, what they have, and it seems as if Hezekiah, who had this wonderful moment of being an example of what a great king would be like and should look like, also has a moment in which, in some ways, now he looks like King Ahaz, and he's trying to develop an alliance which would be protective for Judah. Against all of that, the book of Isaiah presents another king, a king that will ultimately be something of a messianic king, a king that will come out of the line of David. And the picture is God's judgment comes. It's as if that judgment cuts a great tree down, but a stump is left. The stump is burned, but that becomes the seed of David. It is out of that stump that there will be a shoot that grows. And the imaging here is very powerful as it depicts what Israel and Judah have become. They are a great tree that has fallen, and yet out of that, even on the other side of the judgment of all of that and of the burning stump, God has indeed shown himself to be a God of hope. As this shoot comes out, grows out of the stump itself, and we begin to see that in terms of God's king, the king that will come out of this, the future that will come out of this, the kingdom that will come out of this. So we'll see a lot of things in the opening part of Isaiah, or in the chapters 1 through 39, in which we see the old city, the new city, we see God's judgment, we see the kingdom fall, we see that God's hope is still, however, still very much part of the story. God hasn't left everything and walked away. God hasn't forsaken his own story or his people. There is a remnant. And God, even in judgment, is bringing out a sense of hope. So when we get to Isaiah 40 through chapter 40 through chapter 66, we see this hope kind of fleshed out in more beautiful colors and greater tones. And now we're talking about the time in which the exiles are set free, and it is here that we get some beautiful themes. God has actually used the Persian king Cyrus to pass a decree in which the Israelites are free to go home, and this becomes cast in terms of a new exodus. And all of this would sound certainly wonderful, and our expectation perhaps as readers from our side would be, well, surely Israel gets this, that God has caused and created or allowed the rising and falling of certain nations, and now finally we have a king, and he has defeated the Babylonians, and now we have a decree and we are free. And yet at the same time, there is still something about Israel and the heart of Israel that oftentimes continues to have a sense of rebelliousness about it. And it is hard for Israel to understand or to embrace the reality that the new Exodus is one that is provided to them by Cyrus, the king of the Persians. Nevertheless, God uses Cyrus. The decree is passed, and the imaging and the metaphor of a new Exodus is certainly the appropriate Exodus. The people have been in exile, just as years earlier they had been in Egypt, and then set free. The people are set free. The hope kind of comes into fuller view, and there's a hope now that involves a coming king, and there's also the hope that there is God's servant. And that is that now the exile is over. God is going to use Israel in a sense to be his servant. And this is portrayed even further as a suffering servant, but the intent of all of this is that this servant, or the suffering servant of God, will in fact be a blessing to the nations. Here again, this is very difficult for Israel to understand, and to try to put all of this together, that now we're talking in terms of a servant, a servant that suffers, and then the image of the suffering servant seems to come to a particular messianic type individual. And in this image, we see that the servant not only suffers, loses his life, but then experiences life again. So, there's no doubt that, of course, when the Jesus story is told, that looking back at some of the richness of how the hope part of the book of Isaiah is put together, becomes a very prominent place for New Testament writers to be able to kind of sink their roots into the prophets and to show how Jesus is connected to this whole thing of the servant or the suffering servant. So Israel is the servant of God, and they are called to be, as they always were, to be a light to the nations, and for God to create with the nations the covenant. That is the promises that were made to Abraham, the blessings through Abraham. Those promises and those blessings will now, through Israel and ultimately through this messianic figure, although the word itself, messianic itself, doesn't appear, through this figure that we often refer to in terms as being messianic, that God's promises and God's blessings will be fulfilled. The hope of the entire picture is ultimately cast in terms of a whole new creation. This New Jerusalem just blossoms into this incredible and beautiful picture where God recreates everything. All is new. It is in its pristine state again, and it is on earth. So the book of Isaiah ends with the incredible hope that through the suffering servant, through what God is calling Israel to do, that God still has a people, he still has a remnant, his purposes are still moving forward, and there will come the suffering servant, and it will be through that suffering servant in which all of the promises will ultimately come to fulfillment, and it will be in the context of that great story of what God has done, that there will be the ultimate remaking, the ultimate renewing of all of creation. So Isaiah ends with a beautiful depiction of where the story of Israel is going, how it goes through the judgment, what God is doing, the other nations that are involved, that God's promise is still good. Although there's great judgment, the hope is greater. And going through all of that, and through the process of being a servant, a suffering servant, ultimately climaxing in Jesus himself, that God's purpose and God's mission of a renewed entire creation begins to emerge. So I hope some of these things will be helpful to you. It might also be helpful to keep in mind just some basic, theological passion that kind of runs through the book of Isaiah. And I'll just mention a couple of these for you. One is that Yahweh is the Holy One of Israel. Another is that Israel is Yahweh's holy people. And then thirdly, that Jerusalem is God's holy city, and that ultimately all of this includes not only Israel, not only Judah, Jerusalem, it includes all of the nations of the world. And so all of this kind of theological pulse is running through the entire book of Isaiah. So I hope that this kind of just stepping at it, taking a kind of a wide, broad stroke kind of perspective and sweep at Isaiah will be helpful in just identifying the major theme of judgment and hope, the themes of God's presence, of what happens in judgment, of the hope that emerges, why all of this is happening, how Israel responds, how God fulfills all of his promises that were made to Abraham many, many years ago, and how all of this ultimately results in new creation.